I want to start our discussion of globalization in Riyadh, Saudi Arabia. This morning, I don't want to talk about petroleum, except perhaps to note how it acts as a lubricant for economic development. I'd like to tell you about, rather than a petroleum, instead about eye surgery. And in particular, state-of-the-art eye care, some of the best in the world. 3 weeks from now, the provost at Johns Hopkins University, our chief academic officer, will fly to Riyadh to sign a partnership agreement with the King Khalid Eye Specialist Hospital. The affiliation commits the two institutions to collaborate in areas of research, education, and improving patient care. We will be providing the Saudis with some of our world-leading faculty who will work and live at Saudi Eye Hospital in Riyadh. In return, the Saudi government is committing major funding to support new research into blinding eye diseases. This includes conditions such as diabetic eye diseases, which afflicts patients living in both countries and around the world. To understand this arrangement, a little background information is useful. In the late 1970s, the Saudi government was embarrassed to discover that a significant number of their citizens were going blind from trachoma, a contagious eye disease that is associated with inadequate sanitation. It's the world's leading cause of infectious blindness, currently afflicting an estimated 84 million people, most of them sub-Sahara and poor regions of the world. It is a disease once common in Europe and United States, but it disappeared with the advent of a widespread sanitation and improved standards of living. When this problem was identified, the Saudis set about at once to eliminate trachoma in the kingdom. In a matter of just a few years, they improved sanitation, established the necessary clinics, and built the King Khalid Eye Specialist Hospital, which is perhaps the largest, best equipped, and most advanced eye hospitals in the world. Here, let me observe that this is the great advantage of petroleum wealth. It allows you to experience all the advantages of globalization in a fraction of the time. Oil is a great lubricant for speeding advances, and it provides us with a unique window into the future of other countries and other regions that will advance along a lower and perhaps more traditional paths. What we see is the emergence of sophisticated and capable peers in locations all over the world. As a result of Saudi's government's focused attention, for the past 2 decades, one of the best eye hospitals in the world has been in Riyadh. In that time, it has become very busy and very successful, with an important difference that sets it apart: the size and the large scale of its operation. Here in Baltimore, at our world-renowned Wilmer Eye Institute, they will do it 100, 1,000. In Riyadh, they will tens and thousands in a period. It is a highly sophisticated facility with absolute world-class surgeons and physicians, all of whom stay very, very busy. Because of the high volume of patients they see, the Saudis often publish retrospective case series studies in leading medical journals. These are the medical research studies involving patients with known exposure given similar treatment when you track medical outcomes over time. But what the Saudis cannot do, because they have not yet developed the particular skills, are the most sophisticated, prospective case series studies and randomized controlled trials, which are the most valid for determining the efficacies of new therapeutic intervention. This is what our Johns Hopkins researchers will do over the next several years, training the next generation. the next generation of Saudi clinicians, researchers, in terms of how to design and conduct sophisticated clinical trials in fight against blindness and eye diseases. The expectations is that these Saudi physicians, many of whom are women, will one day work at the forefront of medical science, making the discoveries that will lead to new treatments and new cures for blindness. From the Johns Hopkins perspective, not only do we receive Saudi funding for our own research now in progress, we also gain access to an enormous new patient base from which to design future medical studies. Remember this, they're doing thousands, we do in hundreds. This is a window on the future. Here is an example of the contours and benefits of globalization, but in miniature. The Saudis gain new training and new levels of expertise. We gain access to additional resources and a large cohort of patients for clinical studies and clinical trials. And the resulting discoveries and cures that come about from our combined efforts benefit people around the world. It is a win-win-win strategy. What then does this small example of globalization say to our current situation? How can it and how should it inform our ideas and public policies? A good investor knows how to cut to the chase and identify what is most important in a business and industry. And since I'm in a room full of good investors this morning, I'm going to get right to the heart of my speech at the outset. It is simply this, ladies and gentlemen. At the end of the day, the bucks are made in innovation. Period. The bucks are made in innovation. Here is a concept that is so simple as to be obvious. Yet, mastery of it is so complex that it is profound. And that is the reason why the innovation is a driving force for any organization's survival. Ask Toyota, as you saw in the papers. This, I believe, is the crux of the matter for American business in the 21st century. In order to thrive in a globalized economy, our companies must operate with a sense of adventure, with imagination, and with unrelenting focus on new things, new products, and new innovations. This is what we must do to succeed in a new global world economy, in which we are just one of a many powerful players. The idea of globalization is very much on the public mind these days. Just to give you an example, one strand of fiber optics can push 160 trillion bits of information per second. And this capacity is tripling every year. The cost of communication is zero. There's only cost is the switching on both ends. Put another perspective. What did you do before Google? 3 years ago, we had 2.5 billion searches per month. Today, we do 37 billion searches per month. What did you do before emails? Innovation pays in a variety of forms. Just about 15 years ago, when American computers and telecommunication technology and the ideas about free enterprise were sweeping across the world. Today, there's a growing perception that globalism is not a benefit, but rather a threat to American dream. There is a sense that in the new global economy, America's star is waning. A recent survey of public opinion conducted by the Pew Center found that remarkable 44% of Americans believe China is the world's leading power. And I'm sure with this audience, I do not need to remind you that in fact, U.S. remains by far the world's largest economy. Yet only 27% of the respondents think that U.S. is still number one, which tells us something about just how deep is the unease of our our current economic conditions. Almost every day you come across evidence of this shift in the perception. As for instance, we saw last week in New York Times, which reported that in Japan, the US is losing diplomatic ground to China, saying this reflects a broad rethinking of Japan's role in the region at a time when the United States is, and I quote, showing unmistakable signs of decline. It also reflects a growing awareness here that Japan's economic future is increasingly tied to China, which has already surpassed the United States as the single largest trading partner. We are also told that as much of the world struggles in the midst of a serious recession, again from the New York Times, I quote, a gradual flow of economic power from west to east has turned into a flood. We cannot deny something is changing. New high points, it seems, are reached daily. China surged past the United States to become the world's largest automobile maker and automobile market in the world. China supplanted Germany as the biggest exporter of manufactured goods, according to year-end data. As World Bank estimates suggest, that China, which was the world's fifth largest economy just 4 years ago, will shortly overtake Japan to take the number 2 spot. China has also 400 million internet users, of which 200 million have access to broadband. Compare that with the United States, 80 million access to broadband. Recently, the notion of economic decline has become so pervasive in the popular press. Just last month, 2 Berkeley economists, Bradford DeLong and Stephen Cohen, published a book about America's economic decline, called The End of Influence. They wrote that after almost a century, and I quote, the United States no longer has the money, it is gone, and is not likely to return in the foreseeable future. The American standard of living will decline, the United States will lose power and influence. I personally think these statistics are sobering, but I hardly think that, as some have done, we should throw our hands up in the air in despair. Much of what we are witnessing represents the success of globalization, which will bring better health and better life to millions of people all over the world, including here in the United States. Unfortunately, much of it is misunderstood. A common refrain you hear today is that America doesn't make anything anymore. This seems to reflect a generalized belief that sometime in the 1980s, the last American factory located somewhere in Midwest shuttered its doors forever. Again, this simply is not true. The U.S. remains the world's leading manufacturer by value of goods that were produced. It hit a record $1.6 trillion in 2007, about double the value of what it was 20 years ago. For every dollar of the value produced in Chinese factories in 1997, America produced $2.50. Those figures would be different today when we are just emerging from a profound recession and China is experiencing a boom fueled by government stimulus money and a flood of cheap credit. But the fact remains that if we look at America's industrial production index, graphed over 40 years, from 1997 to 1970 to 2010, it is a line that drops during recessions, but overall has moved steadily upward all the time. What has declined in that same time period is the number of U.S. workers employed in manufacturing. Hundreds of thousands of manufacturing jobs have gone away, and they're not coming back. From 1970 to 2010, manufacturing jobs fell from 26% of the workforce to 9% of the workforce. Nowadays, the average American is unlikely to work in a factory, or perhaps even know someone who does. Since such a smaller percentage of the workforce is engaged in manufacturing, the perception that we don't make things anymore is easy to understand. But this emphatically does not mean we have stopped manufacturing any more than the fact that the percentage of Americans engaged in agriculture fell from 41% of the workforce in 1900 to just 2% of the workforce in 2000, suggests that we stopped producing food. In both instances, we simply become much more efficient in growing food or crops and making things. The other things that has changed dramatically is the mix of what we manufacture. Undoubtedly, part of the reason of many Americans who have come to believe that we have stopped making things has to do with the fact that so much of what we use on a daily basis is manufactured overseas. In the last 20 years, we have come to a point where when you turn virtually anything over, you find the words made in China, or made in India, or made in Malaysia, and so forth. Globalization means many products made at many, many locations. But consider that today. The largest export categories for U.S. are in that order: semiconductors, industrial machines, commercial aircraft, telecommunications equipment, and computer accessories. China's largest export categories, by contrast, include computers and computer accessories, but bulk of the products fall under descriptions such as miscellaneous household goods, toys and supporting goods, non-cotton household furnishings, and clothing. Consider that the iPod is manufactured in Shanghai, but it is the product of American research, design, and marketing, and most of the proceeds from its sale come back in American coffers. And that is the reason why you have a perception. We use every day the same kind of products. In other words, U.S. factories have shifted to high-end manufacturing, while the production of low-value goods has moved overseas. As one wit put it, you may not think things are made in America anymore, but when was the last time you bought a new cell phone tower or a computer-controlled plasma cutter? For that matter, when was the last time you saw a college graduate stamped educated in the USA? But this is another very important area in which the United States is an undisputed leader, although it is difficult to directly measure the economic output of our higher education system. On paper, China has the world's largest system of colleges and universities, with a total number of enrollment of 20 million full-time tertiary students. In this regard, China is far ahead of India, whose 400 universities can accommodate fewer than 10 million students, just 12% of the college-age population. But in higher education, it is not the quantity, but quality that matters most. Thus, in India, you can learn of 320,000 students taking entrance examination for just 8,000 spots at the country's Indian Institute of Technology. And I might add, you don't get the application for entrance examination without having a transcript that shows a fairly significant good grades. It is in the quality of higher education system that the United States does not just lead, but truly dominates the world. Each year, Jiaotong University in Shanghai produces a ranking of the world's universities mainly on the production of scientific research papers. Of the top 20 universities on the list, 17 are American, 2 are British, 1 is Japanese at number 20. None of the universities in the top 100 are in China. This is why currently more than 350,000 Chinese students are believed to be studying for degrees at overseas universities just this year. This year alone, the number of Chinese students coming to study in United States universities is expected to increase by 40%. Up until very recently, providing college opportunities in America for the world's best and brightest was our secret weapon. Many of the gifted found jobs here and stayed here, vastly improving our productivity and innovative capacity. Silicon Valley has a large number of leaders who run powerful, innovative companies that came to America on college visa. Yesterday, the Quebec government announced a new plan that allows you to gain Canadian citizenship immediately after completing college degree. In the United Kingdom, if you happen to graduate from those 50 universities, you automatically get a 3-year visa to work in the United Kingdom. Recently, we see the, the trend in the United States that really should concern us. More and more of the students are going back. Since 2001, we have made it much harder to stay, even for extremely bright and gifted students who graduate from top universities in the United States, such as Johns Hopkins. At the same time, there are few opportunities back home who were previously non-existent. These days, a Chinese student with an American engineering degree can make a fortune as easily, perhaps more so, back home in China as here at these United States these days. There is some evidence that the reverse brain drain has begun. But is this, as some have claimed, the first visible step towards American decline? This is a difficult question to assess. But again, I argue against despair. We are witnessing a change, but that is not the same thing as to suggest we're witnessing a reversal. When we hear about American decline, what we usually are hearing about is the size of our economy in comparison with others. Recently, a journalist, James Fallows, wrote a lengthy article in The Atlantic on this issue, in which he made important points that decline is a relative term. In this context, it is neither useful nor helpful. He points out that China has about 4 times as many people as the United States. A generation ago, its people produced on average 1/16 as much as Americans did. That is, it took 16 Chinese workers to match the output of a single American. Now they produce 1/6 as much. When they produce 1/4 as much per capita, which will inevitably happen sooner or later, their economy will become the world's largest, just the population base. This is inevitable, Fallows claims, but he also makes a strong case that this is not something we should be worrying about. There is no reason, he says, for America to feel depressed about the natural emergence of China, India, and other world powers in economic science. Yet the question remains, how will we respond? It is in this regard that the perceptions and beliefs about globalization become so important. Here in Legg Mason Tower, we're constantly reminded of Baltimore's heritage as a port city, from the sweeping views of Inner Harbor to an exquisitely crafted models of sailing ships that are on display. Here in these cases, you will find a beautiful reproduction of one of the famous Baltimore Clippers, a ship design that represented absolute cutting-edge, state-of-the-art building technologies of the day. These boats are some of the fastest sailing ships afloat in the 18th and 19th century. They are so successful that Baltimore Clippers were soon seen trading all over the world, reflecting a spirit of entrepreneurship and enterprise that came to define this city. We all think of Baltimore as home to Johns Hopkins University, the first true research university in the United States. But the list of firsts associated with this city goes far and far beyond this. Baltimore was the first birthplace of American railroading and the city where the first telegraph message was received. It read, "What hath God wrath?" It's where the first electric refrigerator and the first ice cream freezer were developed, home to the first electric elevator and the first YMCA. It is a city that introduced first commercially canned corn and gave us the first plop, plop, fizz, fizz tablets, which are not Alka-Seltzer, but bromo-seltzer. You can still see the sign of the 12 letters spelling bromo-seltzer spelled out at a giant clock face downtown. The Baltimore spirit of entrepreneurship is reflected in Legg Mason's history, a company founded in Baltimore in 1899 that is, in its own way, has ventured out all over the world and all across the world, now serves investors in 190 countries on 6 continents. Baltimore and America long have been home to an adventurous spirit, to imagination and the American dream, open and welcoming to the rest of the world. We are well suited to understand the opportunities and reap the benefits of globalism. You can see the case right here. But as this audience doesn't need reminding, past performance is no guarantee of future results. Let me tell you a brief story about how advantages can be abandoned and great opportunities squandered. This is a cautionary tale that comes from China itself. The third emperor of Ming Dynasty, known as Yongle Emperor, ruled in the decades of the 15th century. As part of his desire to expand Chinese influence, the emperor sponsored China's only major seagoing explorations of the world. The first expedition, launched in 1405, nearly 2 decades before Henry the Navigator began Portugal's voyages of discovery. At that time, China possessed the world's most advanced sailing technology, including the use of compass, ship built with watertight compartments, the sternpost rudder, and fore and aft lungsail that enable the ships to steer closer to the wind. These Chinese shipyards built enormous wooden boats measuring up to 500 feet in length, some of the largest ever built in history. By comparison, nearly 100 years later, all 3 Columbus's ships lined up, end to end, would be less than half the length of one of the emperor's largest ship. The Yongle Emperor assembled a seafaring flotilla of 62 ships, carrying more than 20,000 men. Over the next 2 decades, this enormous fleet will sail many thousands of miles to India, Africa, Persian Gulf, and it is likely even Australia. One British historian makes the claim that some of the emperor's ships eventually circumnavigated the globe. This was 600 years ago, and the surviving records are incomplete. But there is a famous and enormous Chinese silk illustration of the time that still exists, showing an African giraffe brought back from one of the voyages for the emperor's private zoo. These were clearly the greatest seafaring fleets up to the time in history. And then stopped. The Mongols on the northern China's northern border were threatening and demanded attention. The cost of building, equipping, and maintaining an enormous navy was tremendously expensive, and there were other bills to pay. China's mandarins, the administrative class that were effectively ran the country, believed there was nothing to be gained trading with the rest of the world and withdrew the government support. The Navy collapsed. By 1474, it was down to 1/3 of its previous size. the opportunities and enticements of international trade, of globalism, no longer appealed to the Chinese. Rather than engaging with new views and new people and new ideas as they had done before, the Chinese, then the world's most advanced civilization, began to shun the outside world. They became a nation of anti-globalists. In 1500, the government made it a capital offense for a Chinese citizen to go to sea in a ship with more than 2 masts. A ruling of 1525 authorized officials to destroy the larger classes of ships. The specialized shipyards that could build the large seagoing ships were abandoned and left to rot. Later, even the records of Chinese seagoing adventures would be suppressed and destroyed. Just 150 years after the great era of Chinese discovery, the Navy and the nation's overseas trade was gone. I wonder if we cannot detect a similar inclination among some Americans and some of our politicians today. There is a serious out there that you can detect from time to time this level of seriousness. It is a feeling that we should retire the fleet and pay more attention to what is needed in the domestic arena. A belief that if we cannot be disputed king of the hill, then perhaps we will just collect our marbles and go home. The idea that maybe we just won't play anymore. What a terrible idea that would be. Nothing could be more inappropriate to our current situation. For the United States to turn inward at this time would be truly disastrous. I'm proud to say that at Carey Business School and throughout Johns Hopkins University, we have never been more committed to working globally and to finding global solutions to problems that confront every nation. And that is the reason we have a physical presence in 122 countries. And to make no mistake, we face enormous challenges that will require the best thinking from the brightest minds. Consider a global food production, an issue that will so greatly impact living standards in coming decades. Even though we hear almost daily about the gleaming our new cities in China and India, the fact remains that both countries confront difficult issues of food security. According to the state-run China Daily, 150 million people face day-to-day struggle for subsistence in China. In India, an estimated 8 million children are severely malnutritioned, and perhaps 60 million Indian children have inadequate nutrition on a daily basis. Starvations and famines may be a thing of the past, but ample, wholesome nourishment is by no means yet the universal norm. The threat of global warming greatly increases this problem. As of today, more than 1/3 of the world's population live in China and India. Current projections suggest that climate change could bring about sharply lower crop yields due to warmer, drier conditions on the subcontinent and in China. Indian officials have been told the yields from rain-irrigated wheat could drop by 44% by the year 2050. Recently, an essay by a leading Chinese authority predicted similar declines in that country's production of rice, wheat, and corn should drought conditions brought about by global warming prevail. How would you respond to you if you're a Chinese ruler, knowing your country contains about 1/4 of the world's population, but only about 7% of the world's arable land? As both China and India modernize ever faster, their environmental challenges also accelerate. Global warming emissions from China and India continue to rise and will account for more than 1/3 of global emission by 2030. This is up from just 13% in 1990, according to the U.S. Energy Information Administration. And we are only seeing the beginning of this trend. Ladies and gentlemen, India today has roughly the same number of automobiles that we had in the United States at the start of Great Depression, about 13 million. By the midpoint of this century, India is projected to have the largest number of cars in the world, an anticipated 611 million vehicles, from 13 million to 611 million vehicles. This means every sixth car produced in the world will be sold in India. Who can predict what kind of environmental consequences this massive transformation will entail? Last month, the scientists reported a huge spike in the amount of methane seeping from the Arctic permafrost, with measurements indicating quantities of gas have risen by almost a third in just 5 years. Methane is by far more potent greenhouse gas than carbon dioxide, and some models suggest there is a global tipping point at which temperatures could rise to the point where many thousands of tons of methane would be released from the permafrost, creating a sudden spike in the world temperature. The effect upon countries like India and China, with large populations and limited arable land, could be catastrophic. But climate change is only one challenge among many. Yesterday morning, you heard from Richard Hawkinson about investment implications for global demographic changes. Two hugely important changes have occurred in China in the past generation that often escape notice. We must pay attention to those changes. The first is the success of China's enforced one-child policy in 1979. Since then, the fertility rate has dropped to 1.7, when as late as 1970, the fertility rate has been 5.9. So, China has an aging population, and in the future, fewer young workers will be available to help support more and more aged retirees. In just 30 years, people aged 65 or over are projected to make up 22% of the Chinese population. These older adults will have to count on their children to provide for their retirement. Children are expected to be the primary providers of support and care for their retired parents, grandparents, and parents-in-law. However, in what has come to become known as 4-2-1 problem, the second generation children born under one-child policy will have to care for 2 parents and 4 grandparents. With largely one-child family with no social security plan, this responsibility will likely to fall on younger Chinese generation that is unable to fulfill this commitment. A second change has occurred in roughly the same time as one-child policy. China has become the nation of smokers, with an estimated 3 million people taking up smoking every year. Out of the population of 1.3 billion people, 350 million people are tobacco smokers, a group larger than the entire population of the United States. Up to 60% of Chinese men smoke. A staggering, and absolutely a staggering 100 million Chinese smokers are under the age of 18, reflecting a trend for tobacco to reach an even younger market segment. Is a travesty. Researchers are forecasting as many as 2.5 million people will die by the year 2025 every year, representing an enormous burden on a Chinese healthcare system, and on the one-child families that will be facing one or possible more of the parents and grandparents battling emphysema, lung cancer, and other debilitating diseases. Of course, China is not the only nation that in the coming years will be facing profound demographic changes. Over the next 2 decades, all the developed world will be growing older, sometimes significantly so. In Japan, for example, the median age will rise from 43 to 50. In Italy, from 42 to 51. This means growth in household financial wealth will slow by more than 2/3, a net reduction of $31 trillion in wealth worldwide. The graying of populations will affect global markets for goods, capital, and labor, but unprecedented demands on virtually every aspect of health industry. The particular problem we face today is that by far too much attention is being placed on the economic foot race, on largely meaningless measurements of who is in the first place. Quite clearly, many of the most urgent challenges we face today are transnational. These are global problems that will require coordinated international solutions. In other words, globalism. Recall the example I started out with, Johns Hopkins' partnership with one of the world's leading eye hospitals in Saudi Arabia. It is only by working together, cooperatively, in these matters that we'll find the necessary solutions. So in many areas, global warming, to cancer research, to social policies, providing retirement and healthcare, Johns Hopkins scientists and researchers are making vital contributions. With scientific research projects underway on every continent and in score of countries, we are truly a global university. And from the very beginning, our focus has been on training and producing the next generation of innovative thinkers. We recognize that our future prosperity and even the stability of our society depends upon the quality of the leaders we produce and the skills and imagination they are able to bring to bear on these problems and challenges. So it is tremendously exciting to be the first dean, the inaugural dean of the Carey Business School, and to have, as it were, a blank slate on which to draw the contours of new style and approach to business education. In the fall, we announced the launch of an exciting new program, the Johns Hopkins Global MBA. This September, we welcome the charter class to this innovative program, which breaks away from the long-standing technique-based model. Our program is absolutely unique. There is no such program exists in the world. 2-year, full-time program features a curriculum designed to be global in perspective and interdisciplinary in orientation and emphasis. It draws upon Johns Hopkins' strengths in science and research, and we have collaborated with the university's other academic divisions on curriculum development, but more so as resources for experiential learning. Many of you hold degrees from traditional MBAs programs, and so you are familiar with both advantages and pitfalls of this approach. The traditional MBA emphasized the science of management, but we all know that effective management is more than just number crunching. Otherwise, computers could effectively manage multinational corporations. There are the soft skills, which are the hardest to learn, that often differentiates merely the average from a truly great. The Global MBA program focuses on both sides of these successful management tools, educating students to think critically, act ethically, and comprehend issues in a global context. Clearly, if there's anything we need today, it is great leadership. I would conclude by observing simply that we are at a global inflection point. To you as investors, with the respective perspective of years, if not decades, I'll leave this simple advice. Keep your eyes on the waterfront. Who's burning their fleets? Who's putting their ships to sea? In the years ahead, we'll see both winners and losers in the globalized economy. Look for adventurers, look for imagination, look for innovation. That is the key to the future. At the Carey Business School, we see our role as training the next generation of global venturers. We welcome the bold, we encourage dreamers in their visions for a new tomorrow. This is our mission. This is what we contribute to the world. Thank you.